As you know, we've been going through Delivered into Covenant, Pivotal Moments in the Book of Exodus, Part 2 by Walter Brueggemann. And today we are going to be going over Chapter 5, which he has entitled Fear That Casts Out Fear. And the pivotal verse that he has selected for consideration is Exodus 20, verse 20, which reads, "Do not be afraid, for God has come only to test you and to put the fear of him upon you so that you do not sin." Direct quote from Brueggemann: Israel is to fear God. When it fears God, it will not be afraid. And if you're confused at this point, join the club. I had to read through this chapter a couple of times. Maybe it was just me, but I found the heart of the point. I found that sentence right there. Israel is to fear God. When it fears God, it will not be afraid. That's paradoxical. So there's got to be more to it. And I did some digging, and I think that I have condensed the main point, which we'll get to in the coming minutes. And first, it's just good to note that this word translated as fear in English has a wide range of interpretive possibilities in the original Hebrew. It's a much more complex word than our word fear. There's more nuance to it. Quoting Brueggemann, the phrase allows for a rich variety of emotional possibilities that range all the way from terror to awe. So I would imagine that we are meant to understand this fear as something like a mixture of terror and awe. The people have just been visited by a divine vision, which included thunder and lightning and trumpet blasts and smoke. So this is a God that demands our attention. If that were happening, downtown Indianapolis with no context, we would be terrified. And we would wonder what sort of powerful force has been unleashed upon us. And this awe-inspiring imagery is not meant to cultivate fear and anxiety as a result of experiencing something monstrous. This is a key distinction here. Rather, it's a fear burgeoning on respect and admiration that one might feel in reaction to or gazing on a great mountain or a radiant sunset or 100-foot high wave barreling down onto the shore. Now, clearly, that force or image that inspired this sort of awe, reverential fear, it's capable of destroying us. Should the mountain fall or the sun explode or the wave come crashing in, we would be undone. So consequently, this great force commands our respect. We fear these things, the whole while acknowledging our admiration and respect for these remarkable forces. The point here is Yahweh is like this, but many times more so. Here is a God who upended Egypt and cast down the god King Pharaoh from his throne. Yahweh is a God that inspires fear. But here's the kicker. This God does not want to destroy you. This God wants to liberate you. God's potentially destructive forces have been put towards the pursuit of your salvation. And that's what's true for Israel. And that's the key point. And this is why it's written that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, and fools despise wisdom and instructions, from Proverbs 1, verse 7. But there's others say in so many words a similar thing. Proverbs 9, verse 10, 15, verse 33, Psalm 111, verse 10, and Job 28, 28. And those are all listed in today's chapter as text to consider. God is sovereign over all the powers and forces at play, and eventually God's purposes will be realized. So in the meantime, live in keeping with God's purposes. Fear the Lord and keep Yahweh's commands, for to keep them is to enter into the life God's children were meant for. Quoting Brueggemann here, Yahweh's will, purpose, and presence are the clue to the meaning of the world and a guide for how to live well and safely in the world. It is this core reference that Yahweh has put upon Israel. It is this adherence that protects Israel so that it need not sin and so engage in self-destruction. The fear of Yahweh precludes self-destructive sin. Life without this reference point will be a fundamental misconstrual of the reality of the world. So those who fear Yahweh need not fear, because respect, admiration, and reverence for the beauty, power, light, and love of God ensures behavior in our communities that is more conducive to life. To not be in awe or fear of such a God allows one to reject the values of God. And in so doing, a people may lose the benefits of living in covenant with God. And so I try to think of an historical example, and I come up with one that I think at least it helped me as I was grappling with this chapter. And I mean what I say, I really struggled with this. So if you came away with this chapter, from this chapter, with something completely different, I would be eager to hear about it at the end, because I really did struggle. But as I was trying to think about what it might be for somebody to not fear or be in awe of the God of, as we understand God, of liberation, of justice, of love, and the God that would, break the people out of Egypt, I thought of a quote from Thomas Jefferson that I believe illustrates the point very well, where in his notes on the state of Virginia, he wrote, "Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever, that considering numbers, nature, and natural means only, a revolution of the wheel of fortune, an exchange of situation is among possible events, that it may become probable by supernatural interference." Now, that's an old-timey way of saying I'm terrified of this idea that God is just, because eventually we're going to pay the Pied Piper, or we're going to pay the consequence for our sins. And specifically, what he is talking about is chattel slavery here. These are words that are meant to address Jefferson's anxiety about the fact that the founding fathers had not found it within themselves to address the evils of chattel slavery. So bear with me here, because I think this illustrates the consequences of not having fear and awe for God in the sense that is talked about in the book of Exodus. In these words, Thomas Jefferson expresses some fear for God. He says, I tremble, right? I tremble at the fact that God is just, but not enough for him to free his own slaves. He did not fear God enough, nor did other slaveholders who felt the tension between the values of God, the God of the Bible, and their own practices of slavery. Fear of the Lord may well have been the beginning of wisdom for our founding fathers in this regard, but they were not enough in awe of God to follow God's leading. We kept slaves and have long paid the price for our sins. If they had feared the God who was determined to liberate enslaved people, things would have gone far better. Indeed, our world today may have been very different. And the irony is, when we fear God, we lose our reasons to fear. We learn that the God who has overwhelmed us in beauty, truth, and power is on our side and will stay with us. Thus, amid Israel's past of Pharaoh's threats, present of the wilderness threat, and future of journey threat, Yahweh promises to be protector, provider, and accompanying guardian. We learn along the way that the relationship that began in fear and overwhelming awe grows into a love that casts out all fear. We discover the power of God is not bent on our destruction unless we are participants in destructive behaviors in the world, like Pharaoh was. Even then, God wants to redeem/restore those who perpetuate evil whenever possible. And I'll conclude with a quote towards the end of this chapter. The love given by Yahweh and returned by God's people in obedience is, or can be, perfect love. That perfect love is perfect in intense, exclusive adherence acted out in obedience. The God of Sinai, long before the epistle, already invited Israel to trust in Yahweh and to exhibit that trust in glad obedience. It is all about trust and obey. That is what Yahweh anticipates at Sinai. It is what Israel pledges at Sinai. The work of covenant is to live out that fear/love on the basis of divine assurance. When fully committed to Yahweh in obedience, other threats and risks lose their power. And so I'm going to share screen and open it up for questions or comments. What do you think? And what grabbed you from this chapter? And what questions might you have? And we'll sort through it together. And as I said, I really struggled with this one, so I'd be anxious to hear how you folks felt. And remember, you're all muted.
This is a very feeble start to this conversation, but on page 45, he gives the reasons which Israel might be afraid are not stated. It is possible. And they're talking about promises here. And I had a really, I don't know that these are the threat of Egypt, sure. the riskiness of wilderness existence, okay, and the ominous journey ahead, okay. But I don't know if that kind of scratches my itch in terms of the fear that we're talking about here. I mean, they're talking about ways to prevent bad things from happening, to put your obedience to God in order to prevent these things, or to get aid, I guess, get assistance, get the guardianship of Yahweh. But that seems very different than the awe and the wonder of the terror of Mount Sinai being filled with smoke and lightning and trumpets and thunder. And so I'm just having a hard time connecting. There's so much, like you said, fear has so many meanings. It in my mind, fear is always like fear of sinning and going to hell. I mean, in some childish basic term. And when I think of my early Christian upbringing, that was it. That was the big fear, was dying and going to hell because one wasn't saved. So anyway, that, like I said, very feeble beginning there.
Well, so what I think you're saying is, the first thing you described was something like a quid pro quo, where you act obediently and then you receive benefits. That was the first thing.
Yeah.
And perhaps fear as being a motivator, juxtaposed to fear in another sense, which is really a physical manifestation of fear, overwhelmed by a smoking mountain or a fire or the lightning, which is just sort of terror at the spectacle, which it doesn't really have anything to do with respect for a person per se, but just more like what you're observing. Is that right?
I think so. Yeah.
I the way that I interpreted this passage, the way it was helpful for me, was to the last week we talked about the nature of the covenant, where we keep the covenant and God covenants with us, and we obey not because it's a quid pro quo or what we'll gain out of it, but because the very life of the people is dependent on the values of Yahweh. So it isn't as if we're trying to make some divine scorekeeper happy so that we'll get enough points in the end, but it's more, here is the way that leads to life. Here is how you treat people and live with your neighbor. If you do these things, then you will prosper. A new layer is added to that in this chapter, where it's not only do you discover that the life that Yahweh is leading you into is fruitful, but you meet Yahweh on the mountain or in the pillar of fire, and it's overwhelming. And you think to yourself, this force, this power, this being could destroy me. I'm terrified. And if you don't know what motivates it, if you don't know what its prime directives are, then raw terror is all you really can feel until you get used to the noise. In the case of the Israelites, they discover in time that the power that is manifest in these displays, these visible displays, these overwhelming visible displays, is not wanting to undo them or to destroy them, but is wanting to lead them into a better life. And so the very reason why you would fear, I guess it would be like just came to me out of the blue, maybe it's a bad example, but let's imagine you were alone in the Arctic and you discovered a polar bear, and you're thinking, this thing is going to destroy me, until the polar bear hugs you and leads you into its den, and you find that it's your comfort and your protective. The very things that made it scary are the very things that you find are going to be work for you, because that bear has your best interests in mind and wants you to flourish. And it's like that, I guess. So now what began in just raw fear of God, because God could squish you, becomes, no, God does have all of that power. Yahweh is that. Yahweh tore down Pharaoh from his throne and split the Sea of Reeds and all of these things. But that force is working for my good. And so I have awe and fear and reverence for the force at play, but also it has turned into a love and a trust where I can guess it'd be a bit like trying to look for adequate metaphors. Maybe riding a dragon or something that you know is your friend. Or I don't know if that's, but that's, so the imagery on the mountain is meant to convey just raw power, but then you discover through the covenanting that this raw power that is in God is on the side of justice and goodness and all those things.
Okay, that helps a little bit.
And a lot of our biblical imagery is projecting out of our relating with our children and friends. But in the very early, like right out, Abel basically sees me as this large force in his life that can pick him right up off the ground and carry him different places. And in a way, I don't to say scared of me, maybe a bit much, but there's times he runs because he knows that I'm going to pick him up and set him in timeout or whatever the case may be. So he fears me in a sense. He's in all of my power over him by virtue of the differences in age and size. But we're developing a trusting relationship of love where all the power I've got is leveraged for him, for his benefit, as best as I can understand what's good for him. And so he doesn't have many reasons to be so talking about a perfect love casting out fear, or not fearing because of this relationship that begins in this fear and this awe. Should somebody, first off, if somebody broke into our house, I'd be terrified, and I don't know if I'd even be good for it. But Abel may think that since I'm on his side, he doesn't need to be afraid. He may think he'd be delusioned because I'm not that strong, and I would do my best, but I'm just spitballing as things occur to me.
I just had this image, we're talking about things that are terrifying, but it is probably really a place to start if you understand that the Yahweh that's trying to contact us, liberate us, is the same one who can be as destructive as a nuclear bomb. I mean, that is mighty, almighty. I mean, I think that is a good place to start when you consider the relationship. So, because,
if they had a nuclear bomb back then, they probably would have drawn from some imagery from like the power in that's random when it's unleashed, but how if the power were bent towards something life-giving is the idea. I was just thinking about how some countries feel about their military forces, how the power and might of someone's military may be a great comfort to somebody, or feel a great or feel or produce anxiety and fear, depending on how you stand in relationship to that power. So if but here the idea is Yahweh's got all the power, and it's bent for it's determined to restore and redeem and save all that can be saved and restored and redeemed. And so we don't need to be afraid is the end result, because once you discover that, once the people going through the wilderness discover again and again through God's providence, food and water and leading them through, they will have learned that the power that they saw on the mountain is something to be respectful of, but it loves you. Is the idea.
Been trying to think this out. I mean, we hear this fear of the Lord over and over and over again in the scripture. But I think fear of the Lord may be the beginning of the relationship. You have that because you know what he can do. You know what God can do. But when you develop your relationship with the Lord and come closer to him, there's no longer any fear. It's just respect and love. And I guess this is why I just don't like this fear, that I think it's just a first step in a relationship. And I think once you truly want to explore getting to know God better, then that just disappears.
And so you just summarized the gist of what I was saying in the big picture. The difference being my relationship with God began this way. When I was a little kid, I was made to be very afraid. And then over time, I discovered that my reasons for fearing God were unfounded. Even if I was presented a bad God image, I was presented an image of God that was vindictive, arbitrary, ready to come down with the hammer. So I was very afraid. And the way the Israelites are entering into this, I'm trying to cast fear and awe, using the word awe more often, although fear is appropriate too, as something that is inspired by something that on face value is morally neutral and allied, as far as you can tell, allied to no one. So that's why I use the example of a thief, right? It's not, no one's mad at, you're just like, I respect that. I'm afraid of it. I'm not mad at it. That's stupid, but it is. And what's that power going to do to me? Begins maybe with curiosity, some anxiety. And that's the way that the Israelites experience fire on the mountain. Of course, they have more context for it because they'd seen what happened to Egypt and to the Pharaoh and the Pharaoh's men and all of those things. But I guess what I'm trying to say is, I would hope that my kids would have a reverential awe and respect for God and the source of all creation without having to feel abject terror like for their life. So more like go ahead, sorry.
I liked Sue's reference to respect, because that's where I was kind of coming from, that, and you were talking about you and Abel. I never feared my parents, but I did fear disappointing them. I did not want to disappoint them. And that seemed to work with my children too. If they did something wrong, I could say, I'm not angry. I'm not mad. I'm disappointed. And then we could have a conversation, as opposed to it being, something that was going to be punitive.
Early on, the only thing that gets through, just sticking with just my kids and Abel, seems to be just like, you're doing this thing, I will take it from you and I will set you on this stool. It's all I got. And it's pure. And he cries. He'll say things like, don't hurt me, even though I don't hurt him. But he's like, he's afraid of my actions, and they almost seem separate from what I'm trying to respond to. He just feels, to him, I am many things, but one of the things I am is this force in the house that upends his life now and again. My hope is that over the course of time, and this has happened with Josie and with June, you're able to develop a more trusting relationship to where I may still have the same power. I can still pick Josie up, although she's a little harder to move around, but I still have levers I can pull to influence things around. But they have learned that my intent, I hope they learn my intent is to make their life better and to help them become better, the people that good people. And, but for Abel right now, much of it seems to be received as just sort of raw, arbitrary power. And I don't, with him, there's really nothing more that can be done until he matures and comes to a better understanding. And maybe that's the way it is with some people in God. But I do know that if you stay too long in that camp of just fear, where God's actions feel arbitrary, and you hear it reflected in, like I had a friend I called last week who has a sort of fatalistic outlook, and he's no longer sick. He'd been sick for a long time. And he said that he must have done something to make God happy. So he's kind of like afraid if he did and if he did. And as we mature in our relationship with God, we'll hopefully leave that sort of thinking behind. But he's like 40 and he's just sort of stuck in that.
I have a friend who thinks that way too. When things go wrong, she's wondering what she did. Why is she or somebody else being punished, for something she did or didn't do? And she's
I think
older
we're
than
told
40.
that's a test. The Father, God is testing us to see how we respond to it, whether we turn it over to him or whether we fight it.
I believe a lot. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think the Israelites had a right to fear because they saw what God had done in Egypt. And then there's that little episode when the earth opened up and a bunch of people got swallowed down. And
Korah's rebellion.
Yeah. And then there's what's her name? Miriam. Moses' sister, Miriam. Is that right?
I think that's his wife.
She got leprosy. She had to be, quarantined for leprosy. And then there's all those times that the Babylonians came down and wiped them out and carried them away. But all of these things were a result of some sort of action from the people that were supposed to be believing in God and doing what God wanted them to do when they did other things. So I guess, they have a right to fear. I just not quite sure that they've gotten there, because then over and over again, I think I'm right, it says that, and the Israelites repented and came back to God, and then everything was peachy keen for a while, and then they strode away from God again, and it all started all over again.
Yeah, that went over and over. It seems like when they started worshiping the idol gods and the tall, whatever they were called, that they worshipped.
When God Baal, and when God and Ashtoreth. When God, now I can't remember it. What's it going to say? When all the people of Israel worshiped those gods that, made them mad, they weren't supposed to be there. And so things happened.
Yeah, like you say, though, they would straighten up, and then it just kept going over and over and over again. And of course, there's the big one with the making of the calf. That seemed to be maybe the worst of the whole thing, but
yeah. And Aaron's the one that created it.
Yeah.
Bring me your gold and I'll make you one.
Well, Moses is up on the mountain. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I want to make a distinction for myself that I do right actions because they put me in alignment with God. Or that's one. I think there's just a fine point here that I need to understand myself. But that I no longer believe that God has immediate punishments for bad actions or wrong actions, but that it does damage me or my people around me or greater consequences than that. And that is the kind of the punishment and not being in alignment with God or my true nature or whatever. So I mean, there are so many of those stories in the Old Testament where people seem to get punishments for immediate punishments. But I think they might be just a narrative device. I mean, I'd like to think of it that way, that these are ways that we can go astray, and it really hurts my relationship with people around me and God. And I'm told I need to love my neighbor as myself and love God. And I mean, those are ultimately, I think, what we're about. But anyway,
It's the difference between punishment being meted out from the sky as a direct result, like I don't know, disease or a plague or pestilence. We did this thing, now we're having this. To the metaphor used in the Gospels about we reaping what we sow. There's two. Both perspectives are in the scripture, and much of the life of Israel lived in a world where it was believed that the heavens. Bye, Connie. Oh, maybe back into it. Where it was believed that, similar to the man, my last church, who was dying, who had a broken hip, and he was just laying on his hospital bed, wanting to know what he had done to be in that much pain, what he had done to God, as if that were, and I tried to share with him basically my conviction in what you said, which is I don't believe that God is up there throwing down punishments, but we do face the consequences for our actions, and some of the times we face consequences that are unfair. Sometimes it's one of the best narrative hooks in any good story, that the person gets their comeuppance not for the effort of the hero, but because they pulled the whole thing down on their heads because of their, and that is more the way that I see it too.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes we go through things and we experience difficult situations, and then somewhere along in our life we meet somebody else who's going through the exact same thing we went through, and by sharing what we learned during it, then we help the other person. If you don't have a shared experience, you can't really understand it.
I really believe that.
Mm-hmm.
Having experienced that and being in a grief group, and yeah, it takes somebody else that's been there though to really help you.
And when somebody is giving advice and they haven't been there, it's just so they have no idea how hollow and frustrating they sound. I told you all, if I did, I don't want to tell the story again, but I told you about the worst sermon illustration I ever heard to try to help people relate to the suffering of Jesus on a cross. Did I ever tell you this story?
Doesn't sound familiar.
Go again.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, so it's related to that idea of somebody trying to relate to a certain kind of pain with really very little life experience. This one takes the cake, though, but this story is absolutely true. It happened in my first year at my last church. I wasn't the one preaching the sermon. It was when I was youth pastor, and we had a guest speaker who was a student at the local school at Indiana Wesleyan, who had to preach at a church for his education. He was going to get his minister's degree. And so he, and I have multiple witnesses to back me up that also heard this same sermon preached from this man's mouth. But anyway, he was trying to help us relate to the suffering of Jesus on the cross. And he goes on to narrate a bad experience in a McDonald's where, they waited forever in line, and then they were out of things. And then I got my food and it was the wrong food. And then I bit into something, it was one thing after another. And then he goes, when Jesus was dying on the cross, that was 3, 4, 5 times worse than that. I remember he ended on I was like, oh my goodness.
Oh dear.
And he was sincere. He was trying to be creative with his example. And it's like, you couldn't have stubbed your toe in life and come up with you could have related almost anything. Oh,
these just tell you what was like really terrible for him. I mean, this was the sum of his life experiences in terms of awful.
I feel sorry for him if he really thinks that was a good example to give to try to.
He did when he was like. He did when he was like, he would have been 21 or 20, maybe 22 at the time. So this was,
that's his life experience.
Yeah.
That was maybe 15 or 16 years ago. So hopefully since then he's, I just remember hearing that and turning to Kelly, and we were just like, and everyone in the sanctuary was just like, Like, shocked.
Oh, man.
'Cause I remember very clearly he ended on 5. 3,
4,
4,
Five.
5 times worse than that.
Do I hear
Oh,
a six?
dear.
He could have said like multiple million times worse than that. And I would say,
Right.
well, who knows, but maybe that's closer. But why did you use that as your starting point? But
5.
Uh,
so my mind went there, Janet, when you talk about people who can't relate to suffering. I just thought I'd share that. But
yeah.
when somebody is trying to speak wisdom and they're coming from a place of naivety, usually the only one who's unaware of it is the person sharing it.
Mm-hmm.
Oh. I think the fear is more in the Old Testament because Jesus gives us hope.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus isn't about fear. Jesus says, I've come to save you. And I just think that fear thing is more Old Testament.
Yeah, that's how it seems to me too, Sue. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even that passage from 1 John was about love and obedience rather than just, fearing and obeying. So,
And again, fear in the Hebrew Bible carries with it different connotations than just simply being afraid too. That's another thing to remember, something we touched on from the onset. It's not exactly the same. I wish we had more. I wish our language was more nuanced, because we run into this a lot with biblical interpretation, or there's a word that just doesn't have its equivalence. But I think of, again, that's why I use visible illustrations like your response to a mountain or the blazing sun, like just, that kind of fear isn't exactly. But I agree with you, Sue. I'm recovering from, childhood where my basis for belief was fear. And it's not, you can't stay in that place without being very miserable. And I don't think it's the right leaping off point either.
well, it's kind of like you said, Abel has to mature into his relationship with you. And that may be where we all started was, fear of destruction, fear of terrible punishment, rather than fear as love and obedience and awe.
Yeah, and I pick him up, the little guy. I never strike him,
I'm
but I pick
sure.
him up and he just goes, "Don't hurt me, don't hurt
Yeah.
me." I'm like,
Well,
I'm like, don't want you to, but he fears me in that sense.
mhm. You're big. You have a deep voice. I mean, you're very powerful.
Thank you. I've
Does
never
he-
had that said about me. I'm big
To
and I have a
him,
deep voice
for
and I'm
him.
very- yeah, I know.
I don't. The word fear. As a child, you read the Bible and you think fear is, something you should be afraid of. And it took me a while to understand that fear had all these connotations to it, of awe and wonder. And still sometimes I'll be reading the Bible and the word fear will come out and I'll think, now, is this the scared fear or is this the worshipful fear? I mean, it's in there so much, they, even like the New Testament where it says, "Fear not, I bring you good tidings of great joy." Why did they have to use fear? Why couldn't they have worded it differently? I mean, I understand, but that is fear not, like don't be scared. Oh, really? There are some, I think, now. Which fear is this?
Well, so what did you think about? Did that help the example of Thomas Jefferson talking about how he trembled at the thought that God was just, but pulling that thread, didn't tremble so much that he was willing to free his slaves? I'm not going after Jefferson here. They're all. I'm just saying this was a historic fact that most of our founding fathers owned slaves. Some of them carried the conviction that it was ethically wrong to do so, and yet still did not fear God enough to move on that impulse. And so
I do think we have to realize that slavery has gone on for years and years and years. And at that point, it may, someone may not thought it was the right thing to enslave someone, but after all, everybody does it, and I need them to work my plantation. And there's also a different degree of how you treat yourself.
Mhm.
I mean, they may be slaves, but if they have enough food and they have warmth and shelter, it's not money they can put in the bank, but they're being cared for.
I don't buy that, Sue. I'm sorry.
You
I mean,
don't?
no, not that part that they were taken
there
care of.
are historic models of slavery, like what happened in Rome when we talk about slaves in the Bible, where some slaves were like the slaves in the United States. They were chattel slaves with no volition and would often die young from the cruelty of the labor. That was the slavery we had, almost universally, with some exceptions, but mostly that was what we had. But then there were other classes of slaves in Rome that we would call it more of an indentured servitude, while they would still call it slaves. And it was an economic arrangement made with a profitable house, with the end result being their eventual freedom and potentially even being landowners themselves. The slavery that Thomas Jefferson was talking about was the chattel slavery of the North American slave trade, which actually historically stands out as one of the cruelest iterations of owning humans that has been. I mean, there are others that are comparable, but from the percentage that died in just the transit across the Atlantic for being packed without being able to really move underneath ships, to being continually bred as cattle, chased down if they escaped.
Having their children ripped away from them. They have no control over that, any part of their lives, really. Just that thought of, being separated from your husband or your family is just so heartrending for me.
But isn't there a story in the Bible where the one place said that they were to be freed after 7 years unless they wanted to stay, and then they take the or something and put something in their ear, and I don't know.
There is actually in some of the material that we're going to skim over. There's how to treat a slave well, and the reality is, much of the biblical world assumed, the world that we find in the Bible up till the time of Jesus, assumed that some humans would be owned by others. And so in that instance, you take the trajectory of the gospel, it's liberating trajectory, and Paul would begin to apply it, neither slave nor free and all these things in this community. But in the centuries that followed, people have rethought the entire idea. Should anybody be owned? And we've come to, I hope, a universal conclusion across the globe that no one should be. But the reason I brought up Jefferson was just to point out that he was afraid of the implications for the immorality of the slave trade that our economy was built upon. And he still was, well, he had a certain level of fear of the divine. He was a deist, so it was kind of a different, but he had an understanding of God that was just, and he said that he trembled with the thought of that. And yeah, he should have. I only brought it up as an example of somebody who maybe fears God in some sort of way, but then doesn't go all the way and keep God's commands, which are bent towards our liberation. And we've paid the price. We want to talk back to what you were talking about earlier, Judy, with the difference between punishment that's meted out vindictively or punishment that is the result of our sin. Right now in the United States, we are still dealing with the result of our sin, which was chattel slavery. We're still, and if Jefferson had chased that impulse, or listened to Thomas Paine, who was flat out against it under any circumstance, then.
Well, I'm not familiar with that passage from Jefferson. And which consequences do you think he was contemplating? Do you think it was more of the actions, the consequences of one's immoral actions, that kind of?
He was a believer in the Enlightenment and the deity posited by deists who were influenced by John Locke and Rousseau, and he believed in a God that wasn't very involved in the universe, but he also believed that God being just would see the creation to progress to a better place. And he believed the Enlightenment was a part of that. And so because that God that inspired the Enlightenment, that inspired all of his values, is just, as he believed as a fundamental principle, he made him afraid to think that, hey, we may pride ourselves at reading John Locke and Voltaire, but we're still going forward with this slavery thing. And if God is just, we're really
We're in trouble.
Yeah, we're in trouble. He did believe in his private thoughts that we should not have slavery, and that our economy shouldn't be built on that. But our economy, both in the North and the South, was dependent on slave labor. We didn't have the slaves up in the North, but we needed the cotton for our textile mills. And
when you're in the soup, it's sometimes hard to see what's in it. If you're in that system, then sometimes it's really hard to take apart the components and really decide what's the right thing. I mean, that whole creation of our country was so delicate. All the negotiations and the agreements that had to be reached, and they did compromise, I think, our collective souls ultimately, but we might not have been born had, the founders said, well, there's no slavery. I mean, I don't know.
We've been able to,
I don't know.
Complex. Fund a military, pay soldiers, make uniforms, would that have been possible? It really shows how messy much of our life is.
Is indeed.
And so what is it that I'm failing with the quote now, but to promote a more perfect union. I mean, they knew it wasn't they knew it was imperfect. And so when I hear people say, well, this is what the founders said, so this is exactly what they meant, I think, no, they said that, we are imperfect. We have to get beyond this place and go forward. I think maybe that was a concession.
They amended the Constitution in like a decade later. All of the amendments that we talk about now were additions as they saw it necessary to incorporate freedoms and privileges. Well, I hope that me bringing up Jefferson wasn't more distracting than helpful in this talk about fear. I feel like we had a good discussion about the fear of God, and we seem to be all on one accord. Thank you for this conversation. Is anyone else have anything they'd like to say or add? Or I don't want to leave before all hearts are cleared, as the revivalists would always say.
I just want to say I appreciate what everybody has to say, and I really like this discussion. So I'm glad that we are brave enough to engage in this kind of discussion. So I really appreciate it.
Yeah, me too, even though I couldn't discuss. But thank you.
Well, thank you. And well, we'll end it there then.
Noisemaker.
Bye, everyone.
It's really